we are moving now from the Latin American context to the Black context, the African American context of liberation theology. Um, if we can harken back to the first reading assignment from Howard Thurman, Jesus and the Disinherited, this is specifically about how God relates to um, Black people in America. And let me say, as an aside, there are other contexts of liberation theology, not just Latin American and Black liberation theology, but we also have from the African context, the Asian context, wherever there may be systems of oppression, and people always ask, "Where is God in this situation?" Hence, my subtle subtitles. Is God a rich capitalist? Is God a white racist? These kind of things, because people who are oppressed always have to ask that very practical question: Is God on my side? So now we look at this from the African American context. Now, who is God to Black people? We all know the history, or if I'm let me I'm sorry, I'm making an assumption here. I can't say that we all know. Some of us should know our history, and we know what it means to be Black in America. So these particular images that I show is just a snippet of the struggle, the Black struggle in America. Hence, we have the attack dogs in Birmingham, Alabama, and the reasoning behind that is the ideology that Black folk are inferior, have always been inferior, and there's always this notion in some white people's mind that Black people have no place in American context. But we began to raise our hands in protest. And this has always been a part of our history. Don't let anybody fool you. There's this notion going around that Black folk for a time were happy with their conditions and being enslaved. But if you know your history, you know that's not true. There's always been a history of revolution, of revolt, of not being satisfied with the condition. But it really came to a head during the 50s and 60s during the Black Power movement. We began to protest the condition. Women played a part in that protest. Here we have Angela Davis rallying people for the struggle. So it wasn't just a Black man, a Black male movement. Women played an integral part in the Black liberation struggle. And here, of course, we have Martin Luther King um, at the Washington Monument just before his "I Have a Dream" speech, the famous "I Have a Dream" speech, where he laid out the core of what it means to believe in a God who is on the side of the oppressed. But he was not the only person who played a part in Black liberation thought in terms of how Black theology came about, Black liberation theology came about. There was also Malcolm X. Malcolm X was not a Christian. He was a Black Muslim, but he in a way, if you know about James Cone would say that Malcolm X was also played a part in determining that Black people need to love themselves to the point of not allowing anyone to denigrate us, to oppress us, to stand up for ourselves. And of course, whether in North or South, there is always a struggle for rights, the equal rights of Black folk. And this became known as Black Power. Um, Black Power then started off as a theological term, It started off as a social justice civil rights term. Um, Stokely Carmichael is credited for coining the phrase Black Power, um, in contradistinction to the dual notion that white people had all the power and also that black folk had no power to do anything. So the Black Power movement started, and because it got started and became a very um, popular movement, black preachers had to struggle and deal with that and say how, number one, how, if at all, can we incorporate the term black power into our theological thought? Also, how do we address black power because it, in fact, does not put God first and foremost in the struggle? So we had these two almost probably paradoxical kinds of thought processes going on in the black theological mind. Do we incorporate black power, or do we stay far away from it because it does not incorporate God? So James Cone, who we'll talk about in a few more minutes, is credited as the preeminent, the the primary person who decided that he was going to incorporate black power into black theology. And he did so, and he has been doing so, because he felt that God is truly on the side of black folk. I put this when I put this picture up. We are again. Let me not assume this is a picture, a depiction of God, painted by Michelangelo on the Sistine Chapel in Italy, in Rome, Italy. Obviously, we got the white image of God, and if we are honest with ourselves, sometimes when we think about God, if we imagine God, and I know we say that God is a spirit and God has no color and all of that. I understand that, but practically, um, most folk imagine God as looking like their people. But for us, if we imagine God, we have been taught to imagine God as this. Not only have we been taught to imagine God as this, we've been taught to imagine Jesus as this. And let's be honest, in some of our churches probably may have some stained glass windows. We may have the church fans with a similar image of Jesus on it, looking just like this. And just think about how this plays a part in our understanding of who we are. If we have been taught for centuries to understand and depict God as white, what does that say about who we are? Especially when this white God and this white Jesus looks like this. This is a Confederate Army general. I think his last name is Lee, not Robert E. Lee, but I think this fellow's name is Lee. Uh, Bearded just like God, bearded just like Jesus. Now, if God and Jesus looks like this, what hope do black people have? Especially when black people have been told that this is what God looks like. So it became a very deep struggle when the person who looks like God is oppressing us. It becomes a deep existential crisis for us to determine, is God really on our side, especially given the notion of our history in America. So again, back to James Cone, he struggled with that. And this is a quote from James Cone. Black liberation theology is a theology that sees God as primarily concerned with the poor and the weak. Now, in the American context, the poor and the weak have been historically black. But Cone is clear. He is not just talking about black people. He is talking about the poor and the weak of the world. But given the history, given his context, that he is basing his point of departure on the black context. So God, we can read this as God is taking sides with poor black folk. God is taking a side with weak black folk, and He is empowering them to know that they were not made for slavery, that they were not made for exploitation, but they were made for freedom, like everybody else. And quite frankly, that's a hard thing for some of us to get our minds around. We have been taught so much that we are less than, to the point that we sometimes incorporate that into our own minds. We incorporate that into our own preaching. Sometimes, I would dare say, we incorporate that sometimes into our own theological thought. That, the old saying that the white man's ice is colder. And if the white people say God is like this, then God must be like that. But Cone is fighting against that. And he further goes on to say that we were black before we were Christians. And in a white supremacist culture, like America has been, then we have to turn that understanding black on its head, that understanding of black on its head. Yeah, we whether we are Christian or whatever the case may be, Muslim. Before we were anything, we were black, and black had and sometimes does still have a certain kind of understanding in American culture. If you look at read the news today. If we look at the current presidential battle today, especially with some of these candidates, there's always this subtle kind of hint that blackness is a problem, that brownness is a problem, and it doesn't matter if you're a Christian or not. It's a matter of, are you black? And James Cone is saying here that that's a very real reality, that we must deal with our blackness. And we must deal with our blackness to the extent that we say we love ourselves before we can love anybody else. Um, the, the 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 God, love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Cone is saying that has been a failure of black people, that we have not really learned to love ourselves because we have been taught to hate ourselves. So if we can't love ourselves, how then can we love anybody else as we should love them? If we are dealing with that self imposed hatred of ourselves sometimes, that other imposed hatred and that self imposed hatred, how can we really love ourselves? And Cone says the only way that we can do that as theologians, as people of God, is to really coin the phrase, to really buy into the phrase that God is on the side of the poor, the weak, and the oppressed. And we must be on the side of the poor, the weak, and the oppressed, to the extent that we say that they can voice their own concerns, that they can speak for themselves, that they have a history just like everybody else in America. Or rather, I should say, we have a history just like anybody else in America. We have thoughts just like anybody else in America. And until we learn to wrap our arms around ourselves, until we learn to love on ourselves, then we cannot possibly love anybody else. Especially if we have these white images of God and Jesus in our mind as we go about the business of being Christian, as we go about the business of being church folk. So as we go along, as we struggle with this, as we think about this, um, know that for Black liberation theology, it is always a key thing to really consider our 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 context, our historical context, our social context, our cultural context, so that we can begin to really engage Black liberation theology. I will be posting another PowerPoint specifically on our context and how Cone addresses that. But I just want to lay this basic groundwork for how Black liberative thought has a place with us.